Pirates! Today we're going to be looking at top stitching and understitching and how to use them in your patterns. Now most often you will see understitching and top stitching being used in your woven patterns. Since Patterns for Pirates doesn't have a ton of woven patterns, it may be something that you're not as familiar with. So let's talk about the two different techniques, how to use them, and when to use them. For this tutorial and this video, I'm going to be using the brunch blouse pattern, which calls for top stitching but does not use understitching actually within the pattern. I'm going to show you how I used understitching and when you would apply it if you're using it in your woven patterns. For this tutorial, I made two small changes to the brunch blouse. The first one is I made it at the crop length. Now this is actually a hack that you can find on the blog already done. I just left off the elastic piece that's there, and so it just hangs looser like a crop length top, and I'm wearing it here with high-waisted jeans. The second thing I did is add a full lining. Why, you might ask, would I add a full lining if you didn't need to? Well, I needed to. My main fabric was sheer, and typically when you use understitching, you're using it for a lining or a facing. So I thought it would be easiest to show you how you would use it when attaching your lining. Now, why would you need to use understitching, and what is it? Basically, understitching is just a way of preventing your fabric from rolling out, flipping out, or being exposed when you're wearing it. If you look at the neckline on my brunch blouse that I'm currently wearing, you shouldn't see any of the lining fabric, or if you were creating a facing, any of the facing fabric. That is a sign of a well-sewn understitch on your woven garment, and that is the look that you're going for. So how do you achieve that using understitching? Let me show you. So we have our lining neckline, and I'm just going to open it up flat and place it right sides up on my table. And then I'm going to take my main fabric piece, and I want to match that front to front, back to back, and I want to lay it right sides down so that the right sides are touching. And now I'm going to take a few moments to pin or clip all the way around my neckline, matching my shoulder seams and my center back seam, and I want to pin or clip all the way around. In the pattern, when you're using bias tape, you're going to be stitching at 1/4 of an inch on that single fold bias. So I'm going to go ahead to the machine right now and do the same thing. I'm going to stitch together my two necklines at 1/4 inch. Okay, we've now sewn our neckline pieces together. And now what we want to do is we want to go through with clips, and we want to clip our neckline about every 1/2 inch, especially around these curves, so that we can release the fabric and it will turn and allow itself to go along those curves seamlessly. If you remember, I had made stay stitching marks, and those are the first set of stitching, and that's within the seam allowance. I want to clip all the way until my next set of stitching lines, which was my seam allowance for putting the neckline together. Okay, the neckline has all been clipped. Now, just like in any sewing, pressing is going to be very important here. Okay, so we have clipped the neckline all the way around. You can see my clip marks. Now I'm going to take it over to my iron, and I'm going to take this seam allowance and I want to press it towards the lining. Now we're at the fun part, the understitching. For the understitching to work, you're going to take that seam allowance that you press towards the lining, and you're just going to stitch 1/8 of an inch away from your seam allowance. So you can do this understitching one of two ways. You could do it from the back side and making sure that your lining and your main fabric seam allowances are staying towards the lining. You're just going to stitch 1/8 of an inch away from that seam and make sure that they're being held down. Now, I personally like any kind of stitching that's going to show, which this will show from the underside, to do it from the right side. So to do that, my fabric is sheer enough that I can feel that seam allowance, and I know that it's here underneath the lining side, and I'm just going to follow from 1/8 of an inch away from this edge all the way around, shifting my fabric as I need to. Typically, I'm going to sew about an inch, and then I may have to shift and readjust, especially as I go around these curves. This is not a race. You don't want to necessarily do your understitching quickly. You want this to be a nice smooth line with no bubbles in it, and you want your stitching line to be fairly precise. So I'm going to lay this on my machine, and I only have one layer of fabric. I have my main fabric going out, and I have my lining fabric with the seam allowance underneath towards the lining. And I want to make sure that that fabric is always underneath my presser foot and on this side of the lining. And then I'm going to line up and stitch 1/8 of an inch away. So for me, I like to use some sort of marking on my foot to help me keep a really straight line. Sometimes I'm just going to move the needle over. This allows me to keep enough fabric feeding evenly under the foot and not causing any unnecessary shifting, but I can also easily see my line to keep it straight. Make sure you adjust as needed, especially around these curves. Okay, once you've gotten back to your starting point, you can see here is my stitching line. I stayed 1/8 inch away from the seam allowance, and on the back it's holding all of those pieces of my seam allowance towards the lining. All right, now we're on the last step of understitching. So here on the back side, you can see on the lining where I stitched 1/8 inch away and held all of the fabric, all of the seam towards that lining side. Now I want to take it to my iron and I want to press it, and I like to do this from the back side so that I can make sure I have just a little tiny bit of my right side of my fabric along the top, just about 1/8 of an inch here showing. That way when I'm wearing the garment, I know that the lining will be hidden totally underneath. Then give it a few presses, and then just keep working your way all the way around, and you've completed your understitch. And there is your neckline from the right side of the garment. You can see here that by putting in this understitching, we're preventing the lining from rolling out and showing. Typically, you do not need to use top stitching when you use understitching. The understitching is so that you don't have to use that. So let me show you where we can use top stitching in this pattern. Top stitching can be a really important design element in your garment, so you want to make sure that this stitching is done really precisely. This stitching line is usually more pronounced and it is visible, so take your time and practice some different techniques. Today I'm just going to be showing you a really simple way to use top stitching to attach your lining or your facing to your garment. Because I decided to do a lining instead of what's called for, I'm going to have to finish my edges a little bit different. So I only have together at this point the neckline, which we just did, and now I'm going to open up my top and lay it completely flat with the right sides facing up, and I'm going to do the burrito roll method for my sleeves. Typically this would be used for a tank top, but I'm going to try it on this cap sleeve, and I'm hoping that it will work. So now my sleeve is pinned, lining and main fabric right sides together with the rest of the fabric sandwiched here in the middle after being rolled up. So now I'm going to stitch my sleeve ends together. Now, unlike the neckline, we're not going to do the understitching here. One, it would be a little bit difficult typically on a sleeve hem to be able to do that. On this straighter one, you could do it, but you'll find that feeding this in your machine, you're going to get stuck up here with too much fabric and it's going to be difficult. So what we're going to do instead is go ahead and turn the fabric right side out through that arm that we just sewed. And now we have our arm finish, but what we want to do is press it, and I'm just going to press it so that again my lining is just a little bit less than the main fabric showing so that it is hidden. And this is when we are going to top stitch. Now, just like before when we did the understitching, your pressing here is going to be very important. You want to make sure that you press this well so that you have some of that fabric showing so that it lays nicely when you go to top stitch. We top stitch on the right side of the fabric so that we can see what we're doing, and we want this line to be really straight and accurate. So I've threaded my machine with a darker color on the top, and I've left the lighter color that matches my lining in the bobbin because I'm going to be stitching this from the right side of the fabric. And I wanted it a little bit darker to hopefully help it blend in. I could have kept the lighter, which would have been fine. But in this particular case, our top stitching is here more for the purpose of securing our facing, or in this case, our lining to the inside of the garment, and less for decorative purposes. If you wanted to do a decorative top stitch, you're probably going to want to use a much thicker thread and possibly your top stitch option on your machine if you have one that's going to go back and forth a couple times to really make it bold and stand out. I'm not trying to make mine stand out per se. I'm just using it to hold my lining in place so that it doesn't turn out when I'm wearing it. So I typically use a little bit longer of a stitch when I am doing my top stitching. So I'm actually going to turn mine up to a 3 stitch length, and this is just a straight stitch. You could get fancy here and use all kinds of different stitches, whatever your preference is. Even if you have those fun decorative stitches on your machine and designs, top stitching is a great place to use those. So I'm going to stay about a 1/4 inch away from my edge. I just want to take my time here like I did with understitching, making sure that this line is very straight. It will be seen. So I'm using the edge of my foot onto the edge of my fabric, and that is a terrific guide for keeping this straight. Again, no prizes for quickness here. So take it slow. Enjoy the process. Just kind of continuing to check that it is laying the way that I want it to lay. And there is the top stitched sleeve. And there it is from the wrong side. And that's it. Here I am showing you, this is the brunch blouse pattern. I'm wearing a cardigan because it is freezing and I'm in my basement. But I wanted to show that to you. Thank you for joining me on today's tutorial for top stitching and understitching. I hope you were able to see how simple these 2 stitching techniques are and how easily you can use them in your woven patterns. Make sure you like or subscribe so you can see more content from Patterns for Pirates, and until next time, happy sewing.